Hi, my name's Mark King. I'm Head of Content for EMEA at Columbia Threadneedle Investments. Welcome to this one-off special from the Eye of the Needle podcast team. In this episode, we're going to be delving deep into the forthcoming US election between Democratic candidate Joe Biden and the Republican incumbent Donald Trump. Joining me as co-host of this US election special is Carine Walker, Investment Campaigns Manager. Hello, Carine. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm very well, thank you. And yes, we are indeed looking to answer all the burning questions you might have about the election, such as how have markets behaved after previous elections? What are the polls telling us? Will the COVID-19 crisis have any effect? And what a Biden or Trump win might mean for markets and sectors.
Indeed. And joining us to answer all these questions and many more is Nicolas Janvier, Head of US Equities here at Columbia Threadneedle Investments. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's really good to be back.
Indeed. You say back because you've been on the very first podcast when we launched it back in 2019.
Yeah, I'm going to take it as good news that maybe things went okay the last time around. And so you invited me back. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it feels like a lot's happened since then as well. Nick, before we get into the election, let's talk a little about your role as head of US Equities. What does the job entail?
You know, it's quite exciting, Carine. And of course, it's as I think about the role, it really is threefold. The first and foremost, it continues to be an investment role. So I will be continuing to manage portfolios on behalf of our clients. But additionally, the job really sort of requires me to set the investment direction and culture for the U.S. desk here in EMEA. Second, it's very much as a leadership and managerial role. So from that perspective, it's really important for me to be developing our investment talent on the U.S. desk, to be available to provide counsel, and of course to do all the managerial things like doing reviews and assigning ratings and things of that nature. And finally, it's a regulatory role, which of course is massively important, just giving our focus on regulations and compliance. Really, my job is to serve as the regulatory face of the U.S. desk and to ensure that we are in fact in compliance with all the rules that we need to be following as regulated investors.
You're a busy man, Nick. A busy man indeed. Now, just remind us where you're from in the US, Nick, and is that state traditionally a blue or a red state when it comes to previous elections?
So, Mark, I grew up in the state of Florida, and Florida is very much a purple state, and that Florida has oscillated back and forth between voting for a Republican or a Democrat since 1996. An interesting tidbit when it comes to the state of Florida is that Florida has selected the eventual winner every year since 1996. So in 1996, Florida voted for the re-election of then President Clinton. In 2000, voted for President Bush, re-elected President Bush in 2004. 2008, selected Barack Obama as the new president, re-elected Barack Obama in 2012. And then, of course, Florida voted for President Donald Trump in 2016. New York, on the other hand, which is my adopted state where I was living just before moving here to the UK, New York is very much a blue state. New York has voted for the Democratic candidate every year since 1984. But in 1984, just about everyone voted for the Republican candidate, given that Ronald Reagan won 49 states during that election cycle.
You're obviously far from home at the minute here in the UK. So where have you been located for previous elections, Nick? And what's it like witnessing and keeping track of the election from the UK?
So this is my second presidential election of my adult life living outside of the U.S. So, of course, we had the 2016 election. I like to point out that we have had two congressional elections since then as well. And we know that from the perspective of how the U.S. government works, those are massively important. But I would say this, in a globalized media world that we live in, there is very little difference between living in New York or Florida and being here in the UK as far as following the news. So much so that I would argue to you it's pretty hard to get away from when you do want to turn it off, given that it's all over the news all the time.
I was going to say, you can choose to tune into as much or as little as you like, Nick, I guess.
Not if you watch the BBC or Sky News, right?
Yeah.
It's on all the time.
Okay. Now let's talk about the process, because some of our listeners in EMEA might not quite get how the voting works in the US. So is there a way to summarize that process and describe the electoral college system for us?
Yeah, so interestingly, I know it sounds complicated, but it's actually not that too different from how we vote here for a prime minister in the UK. From the perspective of, it's not your total vote share or your total vote, your nationwide vote, that matters as much as it is where you win those votes, right? So here in the UK, the candidate who ends up with the most seats in parliament becomes the prime minister. In the US, think of, instead of seats in parliament, think electoral votes. Now, the electoral votes, again, it sounds complex, but I would argue it's pretty straightforward. If you're wondering, going back to the state of Florida, why does Florida have 29 electoral votes? It's simply the sum of the number of representatives that you have in Congress. So every state has 2 senators. So every state start out with at least 2 electoral votes, and then it's the number of seats that you have in the House of Representatives. So Florida has 27 members of the House, 2 senators. Therefore, Florida has 29 electoral votes. In the case of some smaller states, they only have 3, but the minimum would be to have 3, right? Because you have at least 2 senators and 1 member of the House of Representatives. There are a total of 538 electoral votes up for grab, and so in order to win the election, you have to have at least 270, right? Which is just the mathematical majority of the votes. So it sounds complex, but I would argue it's actually pretty straightforward. The only thing to be thinking about, it's not the total, your nationwide vote total that counts as much as where you win those votes.
So let's go to the current polls. Callum, one of our podcast producers, has the latest numbers. Callum, what are the polls telling us?
Hi, Carine. The latest polls as of today, the 19th of October, suggest a Biden win with 279 electoral votes.
Nick, what do you think of those numbers? And many thanks to Callum for providing them.
Based on what we've seen from the polls, which of course polls have not been very, very accurate in terms of elections over the last 4 to 5 years, that sounds about reasonable to me. But one thing I'll say in defense of the polls, which illustrates the difficulty of trying to predict an election that is not based on percentage of the vote, but on the electoral college, is if you look back in 2016, the polls on a nationwide basis were very, very accurate in terms of the percentage of the vote. It was just that it's very difficult to do it on a state-by-state basis.
That makes sense. Yeah, as you say, the polls aren't always right, of course.
But this election takes place against the backdrop of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Will that have any meaningful effect on the way people vote or people's opinions in the run-up to the vote?
It certainly will have an effect on the vote. And to understand that, you have to look no further than how many people have already voted in the US. So you do have the ability to vote absentee. So that is to request a ballot and mail it back or drop it off ahead of time. And right now, already we've had over 9 million people who voted in the US, and that compares to just a little bit over 1 million 4 years ago. So I think COVID, people's unwillingness to stand in lines, right? It's very hard to social distance when you're in a line. And certainly the backdrop of COVID has also increased people's willingness to participate in the political process this time around, because of course, COVID has highlighted just the importance of government and the importance of policy in our day-to-day lives. So I would say COVID certainly is having an impact on how people are choosing to vote. But furthermore, COVID definitely seems to be having an impact in terms of people's interest in the process as well.
Nick, can you remind us how US equity markets were positioned at the start of the year and what's happened since?
As you pointed out, the start of the year really does seem like 10, 20 years ago now, just given everything that we've gone through. If you go back to the start of the year, I think people forget just how strong equity markets were in January and February. As we got into the middle of February, US equity markets were hitting all-time highs. We're hitting record after record when it came to the S&P 500, and same for the NASDAQ composite, which of course is where most of the tech stocks reside or trade. And the view, which really wasn't just a US view, but a global view, was that economies were in really, really good place, and that 2020 was shaping up to be quite a strong year from an economic activity perspective. And then, of course, we all know what happened in March and how the world changed. But I would point out that as we got into June and you saw just the amount of both fiscal and monetary stimulus that was coming into economies globally, we have seen quite a strong rebound in equity markets, where at least in the US, we are again testing the highs that we saw in early February. So it's felt a lot like a whole lot has happened just to get back to where we were in February, right? If you had taken a nap in February and woke up in September and just looked at equity markets, you wouldn't have known everything that went on in the world.
And that takes us neatly right up till now, of course, with the election looming. Nick, how do you think markets will react to a Biden or a Trump victory? Let's take Trump first. It's sort of business as usual. I like if Trump wins. What do you see happening market-wise there?
Yeah, I think first it's important to establish, and our CIO Colin Moore just wrote about this just very recently, is a change in presidential administration rarely ever lead to material change in the fundamental underpinnings of the economy, if you will. So we're not expecting major reactions from equity markets in the US one way or the other in terms of who the winner is. That said, I think it's fair to say that there are going to be some implications on the margins for different sectors. So I'll give you an example. In the case of a Trump presidency, a sector like financials, which has enjoyed quite a rollback in terms of the regulatory backdrop and has had the benefit of a lowering of the tax rates, that sector you would expect to continue to be well positioned if you get a Trump reelection. And I would also mention energy, right? Because that's a sector that is quite sensitive to changes in the regulatory backdrop. And if you have a Trump presidency, it's very much going to be a continuation of what we've seen the last 4 years.
And what about if Biden wins, Nick? Is there any particular sectors you can see being impacted if that's the case?
Yeah, so again, we're not expecting to have major changes, if you will, but we'll talk about the other side of regulations. It's expected that if you have a Biden presidency, that on balance, you're going to see an increase in regulations, right? So the sectors that I just talked about sort of being well positioned for a Trump presidency, now they're mildly disadvantaged because you're going to have increased regulations. The other thing, though, which will play out in the short term or potentially has an impact on markets, is the Biden camp has been very clear about their desires to increase tax rates at both the personal level and on corporates. What that would mean is that on balance, if you do have a Biden presidency, you may expect for people to sell their stocks and pay their capital gains at the current tax rate instead of risking going into 2021 and paying a higher rate on those same capital gains. So on balance, you may see a little bit of weakness in equity markets in the short term. It's not that the market is voting over the long term if you will, that we see or that market participants are seeing major changes on the horizon. It's just that on balance, if someone is sitting on big capital gains because they've held a stock for quite some time that has done well, they may want to sell it now and pay the lower rates. And then finally, again, going back to Biden's desire to raise the corporate tax rate, our work at Columbia Threadneedle suggests that if that happens, you may see an impact of about 5% on corporate earnings as we go into 2021, a negative impact of 5%. So on balance, nothing that makes us overly worried that the fundamentals are changing, if you will. It's just that you are going to have some impact on the sectors.
Nick, you're head of US Equities, of course, and this is a domestic US story, the election. But would any market moves spread further than the US? Are there any other equity markets that might feel any effects from the election?
You certainly, the obvious one to point to is China, because as we know, the way that President Trump has conducted foreign policy has caused a lot of noise and anxiety when it comes to the trade relationship with China. So on balance, again, nothing sort of overly meaningful, but on balance, you would expect that perhaps if Chinese equity markets would be a little bit happier with having less noise, certainly coming from the White House. And I think it's probably fair to say the same thing from a European perspective. Our expectation is that the U.S. foreign policy is going to change materially, but the style in which that foreign policy is conducted probably will change. And if you recall, the last time I was on the podcast, I talked a lot about differentiating between noise and information. What we've seen from this presidency, the way that foreign policy has been conducted is a lot of noise, which causes volatility.
Just following on from that, Biden has made some comments on Brexit and trade with the UK. Do you have any thoughts on future trade between the US and the UK?
I'll go back to what I said in terms of how foreign policy is conducted, right? I think from the perspective of the UK, what we're going to see is probably foreign policy be conducted almost the old way in terms of these things are going to be talked about behind closed doors, and then they're going to be less from a Twitter or a headline perspective. How that plays out, actually, I wouldn't say that we particularly have an edge because it's not something that the Biden camp has spent a lot of time detailing their thoughts on.
Good stuff. Well, that's almost it for this special US election podcast. Nick, where will you be watching the results come in?
I will be home, probably sitting right down here in my office watching the TV. The one benefit of being in the UK is that in the US, because of the time zone, the results start to trickle in at about 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Here in the UK, you can sleep through the night and wake up at, say, 5 a.m. and get the same benefit, right? Which is just about my normal wake up time anyway. So if I were in America, I probably would be in for a long sleepless night. But being here in the UK, I can actually sleep through the night and wake up the next morning and see what the results are.
Bit early for me, but all that's left is to thank our guest, Nicolas Janvier, head of US Equities. Thank you for joining us, Nick.
Thank you. It's fantastic to be back on, and I look for another opportunity in the future to do it again.
Absolutely.
A post-election podcast, Nick.
Yeah.
And thanks to you, Carine Walker, my co-host for this episode. We'll be back with another podcast special very soon. So thanks for listening and goodbye.
Important information. Your capital is at risk. Past performance is not a guide to future performance. The analysis included in this podcast has been produced by Columbia Threadneedle Investments for its own investment management activities. Information obtained from external sources is believed to be reliable, but its accuracy or completeness cannot be guaranteed. None of Columbia Threadneedle Investments, its directors, officers, or employees make any representation, warranty, guarantee, or other assurance that any of these forward-looking statements will prove to be accurate. The mention of any specific shares or bonds should not be taken as a recommendation to deal. This podcast is not investment, legal, tax, or accounting advice. Investors should consult with their own professional advisors for any advice. Issued by Threadneedle Asset Management Limited, registered in England and Wales, number 573204, Cannon Place, 78 Cannon Street, London, EC4N 6AG. Authorised and regulated in the UK by the Financial Conduct Authority. Columbia Threadneedle Investments is the global brand name of the Columbia and Threadneedle Group of companies.